What scientific discovery was suppressed or delayed for decades? Story 1. You've got the AC or DC situation reversed. Edison was pushing his own DC system against Tesla's AC, even going as far as using AC to electrocute an elephant in a public stunt to frighten people away from it. Despite that, AC ultimately won out for power transmission because it required far less copper to move electricity over long distances, nowhere near as much as DC needed. Story 2. The supersonic jet wasn't just too expensive. It was solving a problem that basically didn't exist. If I'm already paying first-class money to fly from New York to London, I'm fine waiting an extra hour and sitting comfortably. And when things go right, flights are merely on time. But when things go wrong, you can end up sitting on a runway for hours. A Gulfstream doesn't do that. Even if the technology itself had been cheap, jet fuel certainly wasn't. And the sonic boom wasn't just an annoyance, it was a serious limitation. As another retro example, Laserdisc. Also surprised nobody has brought up graphene yet. It's been nearly 20 years and we still don't have a scalable industrial process. If we did, it would transform countless industries. Load-bearing glass would be incredible, but with ultra-lightweight batteries. Story 3. The British developed, and briefly adopted, the EM2 rifle in 1951. It was a bullpup assault rifle with an optical sight and fired an intermediate cartridge. In other words, it was conceptually very similar to what they officially adopted decades later in 1985. Churchill wanted the EM2 to become NATO's standard rifle, but the Americans refused to abandon a full-power cartridge, even though it's hard for an average soldier to control in automatic fire. Eventually, Churchill backed down for political unity, and Britain adopted 7.62 NATO using the inch pattern FAL. Full auto fire was considered so impractical that British FALs often didn't even include it. Ironically, the US later realized intermediate cartridges made far more sense and adopted 5.56 NATO around 1980. In short, a rifle that was roughly 30 years ahead of its time was scrapped for political reasons. The Forgotten Weapons video on the EM2 is well worth watching. Story 4. In the mid-1700s, colonial Massachusetts Bay had more printing presses than the entire Ottoman Empire, that's a few 100,000 people, versus an empire of millions, referenced in Why Nations Fail. Major contributing factors included opposition from Muslim clerics to the widespread printing of books, especially ones they might object to, and the complexity of Arabic script at the time. Meanwhile, European scripts had been standardized by Renaissance scholars like Poggio Bracciolini, the Swerve, giving rise to Roman and italic typefaces still used today. That standardization made Gutenberg's movable type far more feasible. Story 5. Several points here are incorrect. Craftsmen weren't suppressing mechanized mills. Instead, skilled workers were deliberately excluded from them. Mill owners avoided hiring able-bodied men who understood the value of their labor and might resist management. Instead, they hired women and children who had no leverage and could be abused without consequence. Multiple people worked on early cotton gin concepts, but Eli Whitney was the first to connect the idea to large-scale plantation agriculture in the American South, at a time when plantations desperately needed a new cash crop. DC power reached the market first because DC generators and wiring systems were more intuitive. Edison later tried to suppress AC because, by around 1900, AC had closed the technology gap and was rapidly overtaking DC thanks to simpler construction and superior scalability. Starlite was essentially a hoax promoted by one man. Materials exist that replicate some of its claimed properties, but there's no miracle substance that does everything. Story 6.
You mean like electric cars?
From the 90s onward, electric vehicles weren't rare. Models like the Chevrolet S10 EV and Ford Ranger EV even appeared on children's educational TV. Electric motors have far fewer moving parts than internal combustion engines and require much less maintenance. Automakers slowed adoption by constantly changing plug standards, delaying universal connectors. It took years before SAE J1772 and IEC 6219 became standardized in North America and Europe. Wydak's refusal to pursue digital photography, despite inventing the first digital camera so as not to undermine film sales, is another classic example. Story 7. Hydrogen cars, especially fuel cell vehicles, are a prime example. Fuel cells themselves work well, but manufacturing costs are enormous, and hydrogen is extremely difficult to produce, store, and transport. And honestly, Shinzo Abe's ghost should probably tell everyone to let it go. Hydrogen vehicles lost to battery electric cars over a decade ago. The push existed largely so Japan could reduce oil imports and export hydrogen instead. That's why Toyota, Honda, and Suzuki championed the tech. They were heavily subsidized to build a razor and blades model that never materialized. Story 8. Automatic mesh networking. Devices like laptops or phones outside of Wi-Fi or cellular coverage could automatically link with each other, forming local networks. If one device connects to the outside world, it relays data for the rest. OLPC implemented it. And OLPC itself deserves mention. Its screen was brilliant, backlit color indoors, but when brightness was lowered, it became non-backlit, monochrome, higher resolution, and readable in full sunlight. 39. Many technologies show promise early on, but fail to achieve adoption due to high cost or missing supporting developments. Truly suppressed technologies are rarer than conspiracy theories suggest, but they do exist. Today, the dominance of academic institutions and publication culture makes it difficult to hide foundational ideas for long. The most effective suppression comes from control of critical patents. Kodak's handling of digital photography is one example, but the steam engine is another. James Watt held patents on essential components that made steam engines practical. Early engines relied on condensing steam to create near vacuums, limiting pressure differences to about 1 bar. Higher pressure steam would have dramatically increased power and efficiency, but Watt's patents restricted progress in that direction for years. Story 10. Urban trams and rail systems were partially dismantled in the 1960s due to pressure from oil and automobile companies. Bose electromagnetic suspension is another case. It worked, but was prohibitively expensive. Also, the Edison versus Tesla narrative is mostly fabricated. It was Edison versus Westinghouse. Tesla's role was developing a working AC polyphase motor. DC is simpler to understand, but far worse for long-distance transmission than AC. Back in 1960s Denmark, cars were widely seen as the future, symbols of progress and prosperity. Massive highways were planned through Copenhagen. Thankfully, much of that thinking faded before it was implemented, aside from projects like Ringvasion. That era left its mark, but it could have been far worse. Story 11. While I certainly can't give credence to any specific fringe theory, Tesla was, after all, a phenomenally creative person with almost supernatural intuition. It's not entirely impossible that he happened upon a discovery or two we haven't made yet, simply by taking a different route. Certainly the seizure of his papers indicates that something he was exploring was of interest, but that something may well have been theoretical work on particle beams or some completely different area. Another thing, which I suppose applies to the overall topic of the thread, is that generally speculative research without clearly deliverable applications isn't pursued or at least isn't funded from above, so that things proceed incrementally with few paradigm shifts. While most likely there was nothing we in 2024 would consider earth-shattering, German aerospace-related research in late World War II was exploring all sorts of radical avenues. While some of it ended up in US and Soviet products, quite a lot ended up gathering dust due to overclassification. Story 12. I worked in the Packaging Systems Division Chemistry and Research Department at 3M a long time ago. Anyway, I worked directly on food containers and such that required newly invented chemicals and getting FDA approval. Things like microwave popcorn. I personally worked on microwave bacon, etc. I met the guy who invented Post-it notes. It was amazing how many great products they had found, researched, and knew would be a great product. However, they would have a meeting, and if the market wasn't going to be large enough, it was not worth the money to get FDA tested. At the time, companies like 3M had to do some animal testing. They hated it because it was very expensive, and everyone likes animals, so a PR disaster. But it was required to be brought to market for some things. Story 13. The Antikythera mechanism. There was a workshop somewhere manufacturing complex gear-based analog calculation machines in ancient Greece. They were probably only a few steps off a Babbage-style difference engine computer. Apart from a few scraps of corroded metal found in a shipwreck, no other trace remains of what must have been a hideously expensive handmade technology. Story 14. I wanted to chime in about Roman concrete because it has slowly become so distorted that it usually ends up like one of those lost secret technology stories with many points of confusion and exaggeration. It is also a misrepresentation of a number of scientific articles, particularly the one by Marie Jackson et al. From the University of Utah, from which many pop science articles derive the idea that Roman concrete is better because it gets stronger, which is highly misleading. First of all, not all Roman concrete is the same. The Romans used variations of concrete depending on the materials that were available near the building site, but also showed a variability of ingredients/mixtures. It's natural because even though they understood the physical aspects of its hardening, they didn't understand the chemical mechanisms behind such complicated processes, which is understandable for that time. The various excavated ancient structures, of which few remain intact, show a great variability in their mineralogy, mainly due to the volcanic sites from which the mortar materials were taken from. It's also important to note that concrete used to build the Pantheon, for example, is not exactly the same used in harbors, and it's this latter one that attracted attention, both deservedly but also undeservedly. Story 15. We know several ways of moving large stone blocks using Neolithic and Bronze Age technology. Some of the techniques have been used by experimental archaeology to construct things such as a small pyramid. We don't know exactly which ones they used, as they had a number of options. I read about a fun theory about the Easter Island statues a while back. For a long time, the theory was that they were rolled on tree trunks, but that would have still been quite a physically intensive feat. The new theory suggested they were wobbled to their location using ropes. An archaeologist and his team proved that using this method you could move these giant heavy statues with just a small amount of people. What I liked about the theory was that according to legend, the statues walked to their location, which is kind of what wobbling something forward would look like. Story 16. This is sorta off topic, but Emperor Claudius was confirmed to have a dictionary of sorts that would help us translate the now long extinct language of the Etruscans, a civilization who inhabited the Italian peninsula thousands of years before the Latins and Mycenaeans, into Latin. Unfortunately, it was stolen lost, according to some sources. They were great bookkeepers, and we have many Etruscan artifacts that we can't translate. Many have taken cracks at it, but many of it remains untranslated. It would be great to know what their day-to-day life was like, as they're one of the few known pre-Proto-Indo-European civilizations in Europe that had a writing system and recorded their own history. Story 17. The electric cars thing is a bit of a misunderstanding. Combustion engines were just relatively affordable with the advent of internal starters and carburetors. Relatively, electric cars like the Baker Electric couldn't really even go 100 miles, and the batteries needed to be reconditioned. 20 years ago, GM had a lease option for an electric car to comply with California regulations. They realized that they could just lobby the regulators to death and piss away money in hydrogen car nonsense instead. Then they killed the leases. Who killed the electric car was about that. It would cost billions of dollars to make an electric car commercially viable, and it eventually happened. Not because it was suppressed, but because it wasn't a good business decision for quarterly profit-driven, revolving door CEOs. Story 18. Starlite would have made quite an impact, a material capable of withstanding and insulating from extreme heat without releasing toxins, even capable of withstanding a nuclear blast. And the inventor created it in his kitchen at home with materials that are relatively cheap and easy to obtain. According to the documentary I watched about it, NASA was interested in Starlite as an alternative to the ceramic plates used to cover the space shuttle. Starlite would have provided better protection from re-entry heat, been significantly cheaper to produce and apply when applied, lowered the weight of the space shuttle, which in turn lowers the amount of fuel needed. Unfortunately, the inventor got a bit paranoid about sharing the recipe, fearing that as soon as he revealed it or even attempted to patent it, corporations would steal it from him. He died in 2011, taking the secret of Starlite with him to the grave. Supposedly, a few close relatives know the recipe, but they've never given any definitive answers. Thermashield LLC claims to have acquired the rights to Starlite in 2013 and replicate. They've done public demonstrations and had their samples tested by third parties. Story 19. Archimedes developed infinitesimal methods that foreshadowed calculus nearly 2,000 years before Newton and Leibniz. He used this to prove various geometric theorems. It likely never caught on because mathematics at the time lacked the formalism at the time to make these methods rigorous. Today we can recognize his method as an early application of integrals. But at a time when all of mathematics was based on geometry and symbolic mathematics did not even exist, it must have been a very difficult concept to his contemporaries. Story 20. Wardenclyffe was not a Tesla coil, although it had one in it. Discovery Channel did a documentary called Tesla's Death Ray, a murder declassified. It appears to have been yanked from distribution, so it had to be watched when it aired. In the documentary, it was found out as it was being recorded that Tesla was not talking about wireless transmission of power through the air, but wireless transmission of power through the ground. The transmission antenna was 120 feet underground, a large copper rod, 300 feet long, found by discovering the architect's original drawings. The team went to the Tesla Museum in Belgrade, and at the time were shown Tesla's laboratory notebooks where multiple pages were torn out. Those had to be torn out by John Trump because he was the only electrical engineer that would have known what was on those pages. History Channel did a documentary on Tesla, recorded during 2017, aired in 2018, which they have uploaded episode 1 to YouTube. Dr. Travis Taylor, who has 2 PhDs and a career of working on classified projects for the US Army and NASA, had never heard of Nikola Tesla before that. They also went to the Tesla Museum in Belgrade. The series ended abruptly just as they were uncovering major findings and proving Tesla was working right up to the time of his death. Story 21. The simple answer to this question is no. Scientists only became prominent by rejecting Tesla. Einstein became prominent by blackballing Tesla from the European ivory tower of physics. Morgan bought the New York Times to slander, badmouth, and defame Tesla into oblivion. Look at who is considered a prominent scientist in the present. All of them reject Tesla's findings. Einstein is a golden calf idol on a pedestal when he was making multiple mistakes his whole life and having to declare retractions and corrections, often after Tesla informing him where he was wrong. Prominent scientists often end up being blind and delusional. The past century of incorrect physics has only led to the cosmological crisis. Empirical science supersedes theoretical science. The scientists of today think deeply instead of clearly. One must be sane to think clearly, but one can think deeply and be quite insane. Today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments, and they wander off through equation after equation and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality. Nikola Tesla, Modern Mechanics and Inventions, 1934. Story 22. Most of the time, research isn't like a big eureka mad scientist moment. Usually it's a study or series of studies that's funded by either a grant, pharmaceutical or device company, or institution/military, and has gone through a bunch of regulatory protocols. In addition, they often publish preliminary findings unless the research is really top secret, and tend to have a whole team of people doing different aspects of the research, from bench work to technicians to statisticians, data analysis, program managers, as well as department heads the scientists report to. Story 23. Henry Cavendish was basically a living embodiment of this idea, not so much because he was afraid of his discoveries, but because he was painfully socially reclusive to a debilitating extent. But he was also a genius and inherited vast sums of money. When he died in 1810, he was one of the largest depositors at the Bank of England. It was only decades after his death that it was found he had preempted a large number of other discoveries and just never bothered to tell anyone about them. From his wiki page, because of his asocial and secretive behavior, Cavendish often avoided publishing his work, and much of his findings were not told even to his fellow scientists. In the late 19th century, long after his death, James Clerk Maxwell looked through Cavendish's papers and found observations and results for which others had been given credit. Examples of what was included in Cavendish's discoveries or anticipations were Richter's law of reciprocal proportions, Ohm's law, Dalton's law of partial pressures, principles of electrical conductivity, including Coulomb's law, and Charles's law of gases. A manuscript Heat, tentatively dated between 1783 and 1790, describes a mechanical theory of heat. Hitherto unknown, the manuscript was analyzed in the early 21st century. Historian of science Russell McCormack proposed that heat is the only 18th century work prefiguring thermodynamics. Theoretical physicist Dietrich Belitz concluded that in this work Cavendish got the nature of heat essentially right. Story 24. Aluminum was a known substance in metal form going back to the mid-1700s, it's just no one could figure out how to isolate it. In the mid-1850s, some small chemist shops with a ton of effort found a way to isolate it, and at the time the metal was worth almost twice as much as gold. Industrialization of its isolation process allowed us to fly, build fast and economical cars, and silly Americans like me have an unhealthy obsession with canned sparkling water. People worked out how to isolate it early on by casting it like steel, but it was horrendously inefficient in terms of energy and cost. However, in 1889, it was discovered that it could be more easily extracted by electroplating in cryolite at 1600 degrees. So it suddenly became economically viable if you had a powerful electrical source. It wasn't a case of not being useful when it was discovered. There was just a big production bottleneck, same as a lot of industrial processes. Story 25. The fax machine was invented before the telephone. Scottish inventor Alexander Bain worked on chemical mechanical fax-type devices, and in 1846 Bain was able to reproduce graphic signs in laboratory experiments. He received British patent 9745 on May 27, 1843, for his electric printing telegraph. Frederick Bakewell made several improvements on Bain's design and demonstrated a telefax machine. The pantelegraph was invented by the Italian physicist Giovanni Caselli. He introduced the first commercial telefax service between Paris and Lyon in 1865, some 11 years before the invention of the telephone. Story 26. Lots and lots of math was done for the sake of math centuries before anyone used it. Lots of modern tech/internet/security math was invented in the 1800s by people who assumed it would never be useful. A famous example of this type G. H. Hardy, a mathematician who at his retirement wrote an essay called A Mathematician's Apology. where he basically talked about how much more useful to society he could have been if he picked a more practical career, but he loved math too much. And 100 years later today, much of his work is why our online password infrastructure is functional at all. Story 27. Government subsidies of the oil and coal industries have set development of alternative technologies back decades in all areas. It's 100% goes both ways. I came here to talk about oil and gas. A lot of times when organizations talk about subsidies, they're taxes that everyone should be paying, like carbon tax, but no one does. It's not a very faithful way to represent data that paints an accurate picture to the audience. When you look down at the breakdown of what would be a traditional subsidy, it's mostly incentives for exploration, which is something a lot of governments will do on their own for far more cost. Oil and gas is incredibly regulated. The cost of developing new technologies for refineries is absurd. Every single vertical and horizontal pipe is regulated. Every single boiler is regulated. Every single piece of steel has a regulation attached to it. You can't just assemble it how you want to. You have to assemble it to an approved blueprint approved by the federal government. This means the oil and gas industry can't really innovate. The refinery of today is almost the same refinery of 50 years ago, with incredibly modest air quality change. Because there's no innovation, there's no incentive for a new player to show up among its crowded rivals and produce anything cleaner or cheaper. Because of this, in order to get a new refinery built, takes billions of dollars of government subsidies, and there hasn't been a new refinery in decades. Story 28. R refers to industrial processes and technology. There's two things to keep in mind. IP terms are shorter and easier to bypass than in other areas of IP law. Make a small improvement to a process and you're free to use that. They also last shorter times. There is no world government. If one nation cripples itself by shorting out innovation in an area, other nations have every incentive to surge ahead of them. So the cases we have if things like this are more economic than actual suppression. We have very efficient farming technology in terms of acreage, water requirement, chemical use, energy requirement, etc. However, setup costs are high, it gets no investment, and large open-air farming, and every logistics chain that supplies it, like seed editing, chemicals, tractors, the works, have massive lobbies and so get tons of dollars dumped on them, staying profitable and competitive when they actually aren't anymore. Various forms of green energy, from nuclear to solar and wind, have been competitive since the 90s or earlier. However, we have huge fossil fuel subsidies and massive installed infrastructure for those dirty and deadly power sources, so they keep being installed. Story 29. Nuclear power and agricultural GMO have suffered the most, by far. Both faced massive public overreaction due to perceived safety issues. In many countries, both were regulated to an extreme degree, often disproportional to the real risks. In many others, those were just banned outright. But a surprising technology I'm going to name? Internet. I'm not talking about the IT megacorps. I'm not talking about the backbone of the internet. I'm talking about the price and quality of service the end users receive. Countries that overregulate ISPs, hand out monopolies to telecom companies, and prevent smaller ISPs from rising have some of the slowest and most expensive internet access in the world. Countries where you can basically buy a spool of fiber optic, hire two dudes to roll you a fiber line for miles without asking permission, and face no repercussions for that, those are the countries where the internet is the fastest, the cheapest, and the most accessible. Story 30. Advancement of drug technology due to prohibition. There very well could be, and almost certainly are, compounds that could cure anything from depression to Alzheimer's to cancer. Researchers won't touch them with a 10-foot pole knowing they would face jail time just for synthesizing them or using scheduled drugs in their work. Even if they did, they wouldn't be able to publish papers or get anything peer-reviewed, making it a fruitless endeavor anyway. The war on drugs is a war on people. Drugs won the war anyway, but America is like me. They literally don't understand the concept of pulling out. Story 31. A lot of GMO bans were motivated by people feeling icky about the tech and pressuring governments. Strangely, most persecution of LGBT people stems from a similar feeling. Individuals have an irrational disgust towards something, group up and pressure current institutions. Pressure from the US government tanked the Canadian Avro Aerofighter jet program and led to destruction of engineering research data. Strangely, it was mostly funded by the government and all the engineers went to work somewhere else after. The government has also done some good things for science while applying what we usually think of as the worst governmental policies. My favorite story is the Chinese government during the Cultural Revolution, stating they were fed up with bourgeois Western science and reorienting their focus on exploring Chinese traditional medicine. Artemisinin, as a cure for malaria, came from that very strange political decision to explore different options and saved millions. Reactionary conservative motivations led to great progress. On a less anecdotal side, the entire field of statistics started because governments started noting down epidemiology data during plagues. The birth of the surveillance state allowed disease control. Story 32. The Biefeld-Brown Effect. There has been no white world development of symmetrical capacitor technology. Go to the wiki page on it, and no mentions are made of Thomas Townsend Brown's experiments with symmetrical capacitor technology. Only his and other scientists who work with ion wind-propelled asymmetrical capacitors are mentioned. Those few who have done experiments with symmetrical capacitors largely relate the energy storage potential of a parallel plate capacitor to its propulsive capability. That said, finding a cheap, high dielectric strength and high dielectric constant material for the dielectric is a challenge. The barium and barium titanate is around $550 per kilogram. Distilled water has these qualities, but keeping it free of contaminants and ions is a constant process, as well as keeping it a liquid and cold temperature. Story 33. Pretty basic point, but intellectual property is the foundation for investing in the R&D for a product. IP rights and the limited periods of exclusivity they provide allow people to put millions of dollars at risk to work toward creating a commercial product that they have a limited period of exclusivity to profit on before that technology becomes public property. For medicines, a pharma company needs to develop a new active compound, formulate it, and show it works without significant adverse effects by doing testing in the lab and in humans. These clinical studies can involve thousands of patients across many continents before they know if they have a product that they can demonstrate to regulators is safe and effective. Drug trials can take many years and run into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Without IP, none of that happens, because no one is willing to invest that much money just to create an environment where competitors can just copy their product immediately and get a free ride for it. The designer of a new computer chip faces the same situation. Huge investments into R&D would never be made if a competitor could just copy the end result. The patent system actually works to get people to publish on their inventions and get this knowledge into the hands of the public can improve on the technology or pursue alternative technologies that don't infringe what someone else has exclusive rights to. Story 34. American baby food came under the spotlight recently. America has a hyper-regulated baby food formula and requires baby food makers to undergo a similar level of testing to a pharmaceutical company. It's an industry that should be ripe for small mom-and-pop operations to show up and create baby food or various tech products to help parents create their own baby food. But it's not. No other country in the world has this level of suspicion of baby food, and most European countries produce far healthier babies than the US. Story 35. It's an interesting question because, while there is no doubt tech that is suppressed by government intervention, it's often the complete opposite in reality. So much technology that is viewed as private innovation started as government-funded research projects. The biggest that come to mind are GPS and the internet, but there are many, many others. It's the dirty truth that flies in the face of the free market conservative/libertarian that so much of, at least USA life, is government-funded or created.